there's a concept, a really insidious concept that has made its way into the public debate that I think is really worth unpacking and exploring. It's this idea of stochastic terrorism. You might have heard this, you might have seen this. It's kind of a buzzword du jour. It's something that you're seeing from left-wing activists and government officials and NGOs and media figures who are also probably more activists than anything else. And so what does it mean? The basic idea, stochastic terrorism, means that if there is a climate of public opinion, so if there is a public debate, if there's reporting, if there's a storyline on Fox News or storyline on talk radio, and then there is an incident of violence that is even tangentially or just by the kind of whiff of similarity, if that violence occurs, you can trace the blame back to the media, back to the journalists, back to the reporters, back to the activists. And of course, this doesn't go both ways. It's only applied rightward. It's only applied in instances where the left says, you know, there was some really terrible language from pro-life protesters, and then an abortion clinic was vandalized. That's an incident of stochastic terrorism. We can trace the kind of abstract media climate to this specific incident of violence. They don't trace it the other way, of course. You'll never see it. Then say, well, this actually goes both ways. But what it is a technique that's used to try to silence dissent. It's to try to criminalize opposition. And it's not just important to think of the concept as an abstraction, as an idea, as a technique, but actually to go a bit broader. And the game plan is pretty simple. This is how they are trying to run the playbook. Left-wing journalists do some reporting claiming that there was an incident of stochastic terrorism. They try to link narratives on conservative media to incidents of violence, whether or not they have anything to do with it, whether there's any connection or not. They make this not guilt by association, but what I think of as guilt by free association. Well, there was one word here and another word here, and therefore these things are connected. The second step is then to get the NGOs like Media Matters and others to run pressure campaigns on companies, pressure campaigns on social media, and then pressure campaigns on the federal government, saying that you need to actually investigate and prosecute journalists who are bringing up these narratives or supposedly engaging in hateful speech. We saw this, of course, recently with the controversy around radical gender surgeries for minors in children's hospitals across the United States. And actually the Children's Hospital Association and the Medical Association, using this logic of stochastic terrorism, wrote a really kind of bombshell letter to the Department of Justice asking the DOJ to, quote, investigate and prosecute journalists and activists who are merely drawing attention to the fact that these surgeries were happening. And these are undoubtedly happening. There's medical literature spanning back quite a bit of time that says this over and over and over. Not huge numbers. It's not 10,000 or 100,000 kids, but this is still something that is absolutely happening across the country. And I'd like to actually go into something specific. I have been accused by a range of publications. And a couple weeks ago, you probably remember the story of David DePape, who attacked Paul Pelosi, the husband of Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, with a hammer in his residence. DePape was, according to reports from my friend Michael Schellenberger and others, a homeless, mentally ill, drug addict, nudist in San Francisco. Not exactly a kind of classical conservative figure. But Scientific American, the formerly reputable scientific magazine, had this article that tried to tie this hammer attack to me, to yours truly. The article was called "How Stochastic Terrorism Uses Disgust to Incite Violence." And this is exactly the kind of tenuous nature of the connection they try to make. So I'll read from the article. Quote, "A week and a half before the midterms, a man broke into Speaker Nancy Pelosi's house screaming, 'Where's Nancy?' and attacked her husband with a hammer. David DePape, charged with the attack, had posted a slew of rants that included references to a sprawling conspiracy known as QAnon, which claims that democratic, Satan-worshipping pedophiles are trying to control the world's politics and media." Several hours before, Fox News' Tucker Carlson interviewed right-wing activist Christopher Rufo, who claimed that drag queens participating in book readings were trying to, quote, sexualize children. And so the paragraph break there is kind of like a logical rupture of infinite proportions. He's saying that I went on Tucker Carlson to talk about my feature report on Drag Queen Story Hour, in which I look through 40 years of academic literature, I look at the activist narratives, I look at some of the on-the-ground reporting that's been done. I make a very substantive 5,000-word case diving into the backstory behind Drag Queen Story Hour. There's nothing inflammatory, there's nothing QAnon, there's nothing alleging that there are democratic Satan-worshipping pedophiles. I mean, there's nothing even close to that in the article. And yet he's saying, I went on television, and then 3 hours later, David DePape, kind of psychotic Berkeley, California resident, attacks Nancy Pelosi, and that's stochastic terrorism. There is a logical connection there, or not a logical connection, but a connection of guilt. I mean, this is crazy. This is like saying, I ate a sandwich, and then 6 hours later, the drawbridge opened in London. I mean, it's like taking two things that are not related at all. There's no evidence that they're related. There's no causal relationship. But it's simply a way to assign blame, to assign guilt, to create what I think of as a default scapegoat. Something bad happened. Let's see who we can pin the blame on, one of our political enemies. And it's like so ridiculous. It's almost not worth responding to. But it unfortunately has gained traction and is becoming a bludgeon. We saw the same thing with the, horrific, tragic massacre at Club Q in Colorado Springs, Colorado. This was a gay bar that suffered an attack, a shooting attack by an individual who came and I think shot 5 people. Obviously horrific. Everyone condemns this. This is an awful thing to happen. But then we have Michelle Goldberg in the New York Times immediately after the attack says, quote, "The massacre this past weekend at Club Q, an LGBTQ club in Colorado Springs, was at once shocking and entirely predictable, like terrorist attacks on synagogues and abortion clinics. The police are still investigating the motive behind the shooting, in which 5 people were killed and at least 18 others were wounded, but we know that the suspect is facing hate crime charges and that the attack took place in a climate of escalating anti-gay and anti-trans violence." And so you have a kind of tacit admission here in the same technique. The police are still investigating the motive behind the shooting. So she's saying, we don't know the motive. The subject now, the alleged attacker now comes out as non-binary. We know that now. Whether that's a trick or a troll or something else, we're not sure. We actually don't know much about the attacker. But that won't stop the New York Times from immediately assigning blame. And the blame in this case is the same. She cites my Drag Queen Story Hour feature story. And I'd encourage everyone to read this story. Again, it's a substantive, sober, in-depth report on the history and ideology of Drag Queen Story Hour. Not my opinion. It doesn't have my own kind of personal take on it. It really goes into the literature, citing queer theorists, citing gender ideologists, citing drag historians in their own words. And then somehow, this is somehow connected by this, again, a kind of guilt by free association. And what this is really it's disgraceful, it's despicable. And one can make the argument, for example, with Michelle Goldberg in the New York Times, she said some quite inflammatory things about Brett Kavanaugh. So is she responsible for the assassination attempt against Brett Kavanaugh? She said inflammatory things about the pro-life movement. Is she responsible for the dozens of fire bombings and attacks on pro-life pregnancy centers around the country? She said horrible things about conservatives or Donald Trump supporters. And so if a conservative gets beaten in the streets or shot in the streets of Portland, is she responsible by the logic of stochastic terrorism? I don't think she is, actually. I think that we have a freewheeling debate. We have a freewheeling culture of civic discourse. But if she wants to make the accusation, she should live up to the standards that she's putting out there, as should Bryn Nelson, the author in Scientific American. And I think the conservative argument has to be aggressive on this. And sometimes you get pushed back because you're getting these outrageous attacks. We have to push forward very strong on this, because we have to say that this is an illegitimate technique. We have to expose it. We have to turn the tables. And then we have to make sure that these aren't used as a basis for censorship, for criminalizing speech, for mobilizing the FBI, because what we've seen over the last year is that's exactly where this is going. They want to use this bogus, pseudoscientific, pseudo-statistical technique of stochastic terror in order to shut down the debate. Because on issues like, for example, drag queens doing mock strip teases for children, if they just told the truth, if they just showed the clips, if they just stopped dancing around what is actually happening and tried to say, well, we're going to defend this, they couldn't do it. And you notice that they never defend this stuff on the substance. They never say, we're going to defend Gail Rubin, the queer theorist. We're going to defend Judith Butler's theory on drag. We're going to defend simulated sex acts by drag queens in front of minors in bars and other venues. They play this kind of game of using identity groups as human shields and then attacking with these bogus concepts that sound sophisticated, right? Stochastic, it's very fancy, and therefore it must be scientific and it must be true. Don't fall for it. It's something that's totally ridiculous.